Before the invasion began, before the border reports were confirmed, before the first airfields burned, the war between Germany and the Soviet Union had already narrowed into a single question. Not whether it would come, but whether it would be believed. This channel examines World War II through moments where certainty hardens into commitment and alternatives quietly disappear. If you are new here, consider subscribing. Now, let us begin. By the winter of 1940 to 1941, Europe appeared settled into a strange, violent equilibrium. Germany dominated the continent. France had fallen in June 1940. The Low Countries were occupied. Scandinavia was secured. Italy was aligned, though strained. Britain remained at war, but isolated, blockaded, and bombed. No German soldier yet faced sustained land combat against a peer power. From Moscow, the map suggested delay. The Soviet Union shared a border with Germany that stretched more than 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathians. Along that border, the Red Army was massive on paper. Millions of men. Thousands of tanks. Artillery in quantities unmatched anywhere else in the world. Yet size alone did not define readiness. What mattered was timing. The central assumption guiding Soviet strategic thinking in early 1941 was simple and widely shared inside the Kremlin. Germany would not attack the Soviet Union until Britain had been defeated or neutralized. This belief did not emerge from ignorance. It was built from precedent, doctrine, and a reading of German behavior that, at first glance, appeared rational. Germany had avoided a two-front war in the First World War, and when it failed to do so, it lost. Adolf Hitler had written extensively about that failure. German military tradition treated it as a strategic error never to be repeated. Every senior officer in Europe understood this. By January 1941, Britain was still fighting. Its navy controlled the seas. Its air force had survived the Battle of Britain. German plans for an invasion across the Channel had been postponed indefinitely. From this perspective, opening a second front against the Soviet Union appeared not only risky, but irrational. This assumption hardened into expectation. Soviet planners believed that if Germany were to turn east, it would do so only after securing the West. At minimum, Moscow expected clear diplomatic rupture, escalating demands, or an ultimatum. War, in this model, would arrive loudly. It did not occur to them that it might arrive quietly. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact reinforced this sense of delay. Signed in August 1939, it had held longer than many expected. Trade continued. Trains crossed borders. Raw materials flowed west. Grain, oil, and metals moved from Soviet territory into German supply chains. Diplomatically, the relationship remained formally intact. As late as November 1940, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov traveled to Berlin. He met German leadership. He discussed spheres of influence. He pressed for concessions. The conversations were tense, but they did not collapse. From Moscow's perspective, this mattered. If Germany intended to invade, why continue negotiations? Why maintain trade? Why avoid provocation? The assumption was not that war was impossible, but that it was not imminent. That distinction shaped everything that followed. By early 1941, the Red Army was undergoing a massive reorganization. New mechanized corps were being formed. Command structures were shifting. Equipment was being redistributed. Training schedules were incomplete. The army was large, but unsettled. The memory of the purges loomed over every decision. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin had removed or executed much of the senior officer corps. Experience had been replaced by caution. Initiative had been replaced by adherence to orders. The Red Army that existed in 1941 was still recovering from this rupture. Within this environment, assumptions carried weight beyond theory. They shaped behavior. If war was coming later, preparation could be gradual. Mobilization could wait. Forward deployments could be delayed. Border units could be instructed to avoid incidents. This posture was not passive. It was restrained. Stalin did not want to give Germany an excuse. Throughout early 1941, orders issued to Soviet border forces emphasized non-provocation. Patrols were restricted. Reconnaissance flights were limited. Units were warned against responding to German movements across the border. The assumption was that discipline would preserve peace. At the institutional level, this belief became self-reinforcing. Reports that aligned with the assumption were accepted easily. Reports that contradicted it required explanation. Explanation introduced doubt. Doubt introduced risk. Stalin distrusted uncertainty. He had survived the 1930s by assuming deception was constant. In that world, information was dangerous. Intelligence was suspect. Warnings could be manipulation. From his perspective, false alarms could be more damaging than silence. As spring approached, German troop movements intensified. Rail traffic increased. Units rotated eastward. New headquarters appeared near the border. These developments were observed. They were catalogued. They were reported. But they were interpreted through the lens of delay. German forces, it was argued, were pressuring the Soviet Union diplomatically. They were posturing. They were preparing contingencies. They were securing leverage. The idea that they were preparing for immediate invasion remained outside the accepted model. By April 1941, the window was narrowing. German operations in the Balkans concluded rapidly. Yugoslavia and Greece fell in weeks. German divisions redeployed again. This time, eastward. The scale of movement was unprecedented. Still, the assumption held. From Moscow, the war had not yet reached the point of inevitability. There was still time. There was still space for diplomacy. There was still the belief that rational calculation would prevail. That belief was not universal, but it was dominant. And as it hardened, it closed the first door. The door to early mobilization. The door to defensive preparation. The door to believing that the war could begin without warning. By June 1941, the map had changed. The assumptions had not. The clock was now ticking. By the spring of 1941, the assumption of delay was no longer theoretical. It had been absorbed into the machinery of the Soviet state. This mattered, because assumptions in isolation can be challenged. Assumptions backed by authority are harder to move. At the center of that authority stood Joseph Stalin. He did not operate as a distant figurehead. He read intelligence summaries personally. He annotated reports. He summoned officials late at night. He controlled access, interpretation, and response. More importantly, he controlled consequence. In Stalin's system, being wrong was dangerous. Being wrong in a way that embarrassed leadership was fatal. This shaped how information moved upward. Soviet intelligence in 1941 was extensive. It was also fragmented. The GRU monitored German military movements. The NKVD tracked diplomatic signals. Foreign residencies collected rumors, schedules, and observations. Rail traffic was counted. Unit insignia were noted. New formations were identified. By March 1941, reports from multiple sources described the same pattern. German forces were concentrating along the western border in numbers inconsistent with rotational training. According to latest Soviet records, more than 80 German divisions were identified in the east by April. By May, that number exceeded 120. The scale was undeniable. But scale alone did not dictate interpretation. Stalin believed that intelligence agencies were vulnerable to deception. He believed they could be manipulated by foreign services. He believed that alarmism served external interests. This belief was reinforced by history. During the 1930s, Stalin had received intelligence warnings that proved exaggerated or false. Some came from hostile states. Others came from internal rivals. Each failure hardened his skepticism. By 1941, skepticism had become reflex. Staff records indicate that Stalin frequently challenged intelligence assessments directly. He questioned sources. He questioned motives. He questioned consistency. When reports conflicted, he favored those that supported delay. This was not accidental. It was structural. Intelligence officers understood what kinds of reports were welcome. They also understood which were dangerous. Warnings that suggested imminent invasion implied that existing policy was wrong. That implication carried risk. As a result, language softened. Terms like possible, probable, and under certain conditions replaced direct assertions. Timelines became vague. Confidence was diluted. The signal weakened as it rose. British warnings added pressure but not clarity. In early 1941, British officials passed intelligence to Moscow indicating that Germany was preparing to attack the Soviet Union. These warnings were explicit. They included timelines. They cited German planning. Stalin dismissed them. From his perspective, Britain had motive to deceive. Britain wanted the Soviet Union drawn into the war. British intelligence had every incentive to exaggerate German intentions. To Stalin, British warnings were not neutral. They were strategic. According to post-war accounts, Stalin remarked that Britain was attempting to provoke conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union for its own survival. That belief fit the existing model. Even when warnings came from unexpected sources, the reaction remained the same. In May 1941, a German soldier crossed into Soviet territory and provided details about an impending invasion. He described unit movements. He described objectives. He described timing. The report reached Moscow. It was rejected. The deserter was labeled a provocateur. The information was dismissed as disinformation. The assumption remained intact. Within the Red Army, concern grew quietly. Senior commanders along the western frontier observed German preparations firsthand. Airfields were visible. Armor concentrations were obvious. Supply dumps multiplied. Requests for permission to prepare defenses increased. They were denied. Orders from Moscow emphasized restraint. Units were instructed not to respond to German provocations. Aircraft were ordered to remain grounded near border bases. Ammunition was stored centrally rather than distributed forward. These were not mistakes. They were policy. The authority behind them was absolute. Stalin believed that avoiding provocation preserved time. Time, he believed, favored the Soviet Union. Industrial relocation plans were incomplete. New weapons programs were still ramping up. Officer training pipelines were still rebuilding after the purges. Every month mattered. This calculation was not irrational. It was incomplete. The overlooked variable was not German capability. It was German intention. Stalin assumed that Hitler would behave according to strategic logic as Stalin understood it. He assumed that fear of a two-front war would restrain German action. He did not account for ideological urgency, operational confidence, or the belief in decisive annihilation. German planning for Operation Barbarossa was already complete. On December 18, 1940, Hitler had signed Directive No. 21, ordering preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The objective was explicit: destroy Soviet forces west of the Dnieper and Dvina rivers in a short campaign. By the time Stalin dismissed warnings in the spring of 1941, the decision had already been made. The machinery was moving. Inside the Kremlin, authority suppressed revision. Intelligence became confirmation rather than challenge. Policy hardened. Alternatives narrowed. The system was no longer asking whether invasion was coming. It was assuming that it could still be delayed. As June approached, German units moved into final positions. Bridges were prepared. Luftwaffe squadrons shifted east. Radio silence descended. These were not ambiguous signs. They were final ones. But by then, the model could no longer be changed without admitting that it had been wrong. And in Stalin's system, models did not fail. They were defended. The choice had already been made. By June 1941, the warnings had converged into something else. They were no longer predictions. They were descriptions of a reality already in motion. Along the western frontier, German formations stopped rotating and began entrenching. Artillery units were positioned forward. Pontoon bridges were assembled near rivers. Luftwaffe aircraft shifted to airfields within immediate range of Soviet bases. Rail traffic peaked, then slowed. Silence followed. This pause mattered. In military planning, silence often precedes action. Reconnaissance drops off. Communications compress. Movements stop not because preparation is unfinished, but because it is complete. Frontline Soviet commanders noticed the change. According to latest staff reports, German units that had previously rotated back from the border no longer did so. Fuel dumps appeared close to the frontier. Camouflage discipline increased. Air activity patterns shifted from training to readiness. Requests moved up the chain. Permission to disperse aircraft. Permission to move units into defensive posture. Permission to prepare obstacles and minefields. The replies did not change. Orders from Moscow repeated the same instruction: do not provoke. Aircraft remained parked wingtip to wingtip on forward airfields. Ammunition remained locked in depots. Units were instructed to avoid alert status that might be misinterpreted. The contradiction was now visible, but it had not yet been acknowledged. At the strategic level, Soviet leadership still expected a diplomatic signal. An ultimatum. A demand. A rupture. None came. German diplomats continued routine engagement. Trade trains continued to cross borders. Formal relations remained intact. This reinforced the illusion. The absence of warning was interpreted as absence of intent. On June 21, 1941, intelligence reports reached Moscow indicating that German forces were in final assault positions. Some reports specify the following morning. Stalin read them. He dismissed them. According to post-war testimony, he believed the reports were intended to provoke premature Soviet action. He feared that mobilization would give Germany justification for war. That night, border units were still under standing orders to avoid engagement. Shortly after midnight on June 22, German artillery units moved into firing positions. Luftwaffe crews were briefed. Army Group North, Center, and South received final instructions. At approximately 3:15 a.m., German artillery opened fire across the entire length of the border. The first contradiction was no longer theoretical. It was physical. Within minutes, Luftwaffe aircraft struck Soviet airfields. Hundreds of planes were destroyed before takeoff. Fuel depots burned. Communications collapsed. Soviet pilots scrambled without orders. Some aircraft lifted off only to be shot down by fighters already waiting. Ground units received fragmented reports. Telephones went dead. Radios failed. At high headquarters, confusion spread upward. Initial reports described provocations. Then localized attacks. Then large-scale engagements. The language lagged behind reality. Entire Soviet divisions were being encircled within hours. German armor pushed deep, bypassing strongpoints and severing command links. Infantry followed, sealing pockets. By midday, the scale was undeniable. This was not a border incident. This was a general invasion. Only then were orders issued authorizing full response. They arrived too late. Aircraft already destroyed could not be dispersed. Units already encircled could not maneuver. Mobilization orders collided with chaos. The assumption of delay had collapsed, but its consequences remained embedded in posture and placement. By the end of June 22, 1941, the Red Army had lost thousands of aircraft. Frontline armies were already fractured. German advances measured not in miles, but in operational depth. Stalin did not speak publicly that day. According to accounts from those present, he withdrew to his office and reread reports. Some he read twice. Others he set aside without comment. The system he trusted had failed him. But the failure was not only informational. It was structural. The first contradiction had arrived not as a warning ignored, but as a reality denied until it could no longer be framed as anything else. From this point forward, the war would no longer be shaped by assumption. It would be shaped by damage. And the options available to the Soviet Union would narrow rapidly. From here on, the war moved in only one direction. By late June 1941, the consequences of assumption had become measurable. German advances no longer needed intelligence estimates. They could be traced on maps by the disappearance of Soviet formations. Army Group Center advanced with a speed that shocked even German planners. Panzer groups drove deep, bypassing resistance, severing communications, and closing vast encirclements behind them. Infantry followed, tightening rings that expanded by the day. By June 28, 1941, Minsk fell. The encirclement west of the city destroyed much of the Soviet Western Front. According to post-war Soviet figures, more than 300,000 Red Army soldiers were captured in the Białystok Minsk pocket alone. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces were lost. Entire command structures ceased to function. This was not a battlefield defeat. It was an operational erasure. Aircraft losses mounted immediately. Within the first week, the Soviet Air Force lost more than 3,000 aircraft, many destroyed on the ground. Entire air regiments were eliminated before completing a single combat sortie. The placement of those aircraft had not been accidental. They had been kept forward to avoid appearing provocative. They had been kept concentrated to simplify peacetime control. The assumption of delay had shaped their destruction. On the ground, newly formed mechanized corps proved unmanageable. Crews lacked training. Radios were scarce. Fuel distribution collapsed. Vehicles broke down faster than replacements could arrive. German armor exploited these weaknesses systematically. Encirclements followed a repeating pattern. Soviet units attempted to hold ground as ordered. German forces bypassed them. Supply routes were severed. Withdrawal paths disappeared. The Red Army was not retreating. It was being swallowed. Inside the Soviet High Command, recognition lagged behind events. Initial directives from Moscow continued to assume that organized counteroffensives were possible. Orders demanded immediate attacks to restore the situation. Mechanized corps were ordered forward into fronts that no longer existed. This contradiction became fatal. Directive No. 3, issued in the opening days of the invasion, ordered large-scale counterattacks against German spearheads. Units lacking fuel, air cover, and communications were sent forward anyway. They did not halt the advance. They magnified the losses. Staff minutes from late June reveal confusion rather than coordination. Reports contradicted one another. Maps were days out of date. Commanders operated without clarity on their own flanks, let alone enemy positions. The Red Army was fighting a war it could not see. On June 22, 1941, it was not Stalin who addressed the nation. It was Vyacheslav Molotov, announcing that Germany had attacked without declaration. Stalin remained silent. As reports accumulated, silence deepened. On June 29, 1941, according to multiple post-war accounts, Stalin withdrew from the Kremlin after a confrontation with senior officials. He retreated to his dacha. For several days, formal direction from the apex of the Soviet system slowed to a near standstill. Authority did not vanish. But it paused. When Stalin returned to public leadership on July 3, 1941, his tone had changed. He addressed the population not as comrades, but as brothers and sisters. The language marked a shift from ideological war to national survival. By then, the damage was irreversible. Smolensk became the next focal point. German forces encircled additional Soviet armies. Resistance stiffened, but the pattern held. Pockets formed. Breakout attempts failed. Losses compounded. By the end of the summer of 1941, millions of Soviet soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. This outcome had not been inevitable in detail, but it had been inevitable in direction. The Soviet model assumed warning. It assumed time. It assumed rational escalation. Operation Barbarossa offered none of these. It replaced signaling with speed, negotiation with annihilation, delay with shock. The assumption did not fail because it was naive. It failed because it confronted a strategy that did not require it to be acknowledged. By August 1941, the Soviet Union was no longer attempting to prevent catastrophe. It was attempting to survive it. The doors that had closed earlier could not be reopened. From this point forward, the war would be fought inside the consequences of certainty already proven false. By the late summer of 1941, the nature of the war had changed again. The Soviet Union was no longer attempting to restore the situation along its western frontier. That possibility had closed with the encirclements. What remained was a narrower objective: prevent collapse long enough to rebuild something capable of fighting back. This shift did not occur through inspiration or morale. It occurred through necessity. By August 1941, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Kiev was threatened. Leningrad was encircled. Moscow lay exposed along multiple axes. Soviet losses had reached numbers that defied precedent. Yet, the system did not disintegrate. It hardened. One of the first adaptations was organizational. In July 1941, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command was reorganized to centralize control. Authority over operations was tightened. Conflicting chains of command were reduced. Decisions became fewer, slower, and more rigid. This was not flexibility. It was compression. The Red Army abandoned the assumption that territory could be held everywhere. Instead, it began trading space for time. Orders shifted from immediate counterattack to delay, disruption, and attrition. Bridges were destroyed. Rail lines were torn up. Crops were burned. Entire regions were stripped of usable resources as Soviet forces withdrew eastward. This was not strategy born of choice. It was strategy born of erosion. Industrial evacuation followed. Beginning in July 1941 and accelerating through the autumn, Soviet industry was dismantled and relocated east of the Urals. Factories were disassembled piece by piece. Equipment was loaded onto railcars. Workers were evacuated with their machines. By the end of 1941, more than 1,500 major industrial facilities had been relocated. Production collapsed temporarily. Then it resumed. This movement would later be described as one of the largest industrial migrations in history. At the time, it was simply survival. Within the Red Army, adaptation was equally brutal. Units that survived encirclement learned quickly. Commanders adjusted formations. Smaller, more flexible defensive groupings replaced unwieldy mechanized corps. Camouflage improved. Dispersion became routine. Aircraft were no longer clustered. Ammunition moved forward. Command posts hardened. The lessons were learned under fire. Stalin's role shifted as well. After July 1941, his involvement in military decision-making intensified. He chaired meetings. He questioned reports directly. He imposed discipline with severity. Failures were punished. Successes were noted. This did not eliminate fear. It redirected it. The purges of the 1930s had destroyed initiative. The disasters of 1941 forced its return, cautiously, unevenly, and often too late. As autumn approached, German momentum slowed. Supply lines stretched. Equipment wore down. Casualties accumulated. The assumption of a short campaign began to erode on the German side as well. For the first time since June, the pace of advance faltered. By October 1941, German forces launched Operation Typhoon, the final push toward Moscow. It was intended to end the war before winter. It did not. Soviet defenses stiffened outside the capital. Fresh divisions, redeployed from the Far East after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack, entered the line. Weather turned roads to mud. Then to ice. The Red Army that faced Germany in November was not the army that had been destroyed in June. It was smaller. It was harsher. It was learning. This adaptation did not erase earlier failure. It was built on it. The millions lost in the summer of 1941 were not redeemed by later victories. They were absorbed into doctrine, memory, and method. The system that had failed to believe now had no choice but to respond. The war had narrowed again. It was no longer about preventing invasion. It was about enduring it. And endurance, once imposed, began to shape the outcome. The final door was closing. By December 1941, the war between Germany and the Soviet Union had entered a form neither side had fully anticipated. The German advance had stalled outside Moscow. The Soviet counteroffensive pushed exhausted units back from the capital. Snow-covered ground that, 6 months earlier, had been crossed in days by armored columns. The invasion had not failed. But it had not succeeded. What mattered now was not position, but transformation. Operation Barbarossa had exposed a truth that could no longer be ignored. The greatest danger to the Soviet Union in 1941 had not been German strength alone. It had been certainty. The belief that war would announce itself. The belief that escalation followed logic. The belief that control could be preserved by restraint. Those beliefs shaped preparation. Preparation shaped deployment. Deployment shaped destruction. In post-war analysis, Soviet historians acknowledged that intelligence failure was not the core problem. The information had existed. The warnings had been delivered. The contradiction had been visible across multiple channels, over many months, and from sources that rarely agreed on anything else. What failed was interpretation. Intelligence moved upward through a system that rewarded confirmation and punished disruption. Reports were evaluated not only on accuracy, but on how well they aligned with existing assumptions. Signals that supported delay passed easily. Signals that suggested immediacy stalled, softened, or disappeared into uncertainty. Stalin assumed that Hitler would behave as a rational state actor constrained by precedent. He assumed that the trauma of Germany's defeat in the First World War had permanently embedded fear of a two-front war into German strategy. He assumed that Britain's continued resistance made an Eastern invasion strategically unsound. He also assumed that avoiding provocation preserved control. Each assumption narrowed options rather than expanding them. When reality contradicted the model, the system could not adapt fast enough to prevent catastrophe. Orders continued to assume coherence where none remained. Counterattacks were demanded where formations no longer existed. Authority persisted even as the structures beneath it dissolved. By the time adaptation began, millions were already lost. Not simply to tactical defeat, but to a framework that had concentrated forces forward, delayed dispersal, and transformed surprise into annihilation. Yet the collapse also forced a reckoning. The Red Army that emerged by 1942 bore little resemblance to the force that had stood immobilized along the border in June 1941. Doctrine shifted away from rigid, centralized maneuver toward layered defense and attrition. Commanders gained limited latitude under pressure. Survivability replaced appearance as the governing principle. Industry followed the same logic. Factories moved east. Production was simplified. Quantity replaced elegance. The Soviet state reorganized itself around endurance rather than signaling, absorbing losses rather than denying them. It became what it had not planned to become so soon, a system organized entirely for total war. German planners misread this transformation. They interpreted the scale of early encirclements as proof that the Soviet Union was structurally incapable of recovery. They assumed that destruction equaled defeat. They mistook operational collapse for strategic conclusion. They did not account for adaptation under ruin. What followed was not a continuation of the opening campaign, but a different war altogether. One defined less by maneuver and more by exhaustion. Less by surprise and more by production. Less by initiative and more by survival. Looking back, Operation Barbarossa was not simply a military campaign. It was a test of assumptions on both sides. Germany assumed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. The Soviet Union assumed it had time. Both were wrong. But only one side could afford to learn from being wrong. Stalin ignored every warning not because the warnings were unclear, but because they threatened a framework he trusted. That framework delayed preparation, concentrated vulnerability, and magnified shock. History did not punish the error immediately. It punished it relentlessly. What Barbarossa revealed was not that intelligence fails, or that leaders are blind. It revealed something narrower, and more dangerous. When a system believes it already understands the future, it stops listening to the present. And once that happens, the war no longer waits for permission. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't decided in a single moment. It's shaped by timing, hesitation, and the decisions people make when options begin to close. If this perspective speaks to you, consider subscribing for future episodes. As the war itself would prove, once events are set in motion, they rarely wait for permission.